Okay, I can't see everybody that's joined us, but I'm being told by our trustee tech people that people have entered the room. So I'm going to welcome you all this evening and thank you for joining us at the our event, Diverse Voices, Diverse Leadership and Equity in Public Office and Education. I'm Kathy Abraham, president of the Ontario Public School Boards Association. I currently serve as a trustee in Clarington for the Kawartha Pine Ridge District School Board, but I am very proud to serve as the president of our association. I'm going to begin with our acknowledgement. As a settler on this land, I would like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you tonight from the municipality of Clarington, which is situated on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas and Chippewa of the Anishinaabe, collectively known as the Williams Treaties First Nations, which includes Curve Lake, Hiawatha, Alderville, Scugog Island, Rama, Busule, and Georgina Island First Nations. As a guest on this land, I want to give thanks for those that have cared for this land, both past and present. And because we gather today on these treaty lands, we have the responsibility to honor and respect the four directions, the land, water, plants, and animals, ancestors that walked before us, and all the wonderful elements of creation that exist. We are all grateful for the opportunity to be on this land, to learn, to teach, and to grow. And I know all of you, no matter where you are joining us from tonight, will join me in acknowledging the traditional lands where you are and share in that gratitude. So here at OPSPA, one of our key priorities is supporting trustees as leaders in public education. This includes working to ensure candidates and elected trustees reflect the diverse voices of communities across the province. Throughout this election cycle, we have been promoting the role of trustee and the importance of voting. This panel is an important part of this advocacy. We'll be focusing on the importance of individuals and leaders from diverse and equity-deserving communities in running, the barriers they face, and tips for new leadership hopefuls. We have an outstanding lineup of speakers tonight, and as we get started, I'm going to begin by introducing Caroline Alphonso, education reporter at the Globe and Mail, specializing in kindergarten to grade 12. Her areas of interest include education policy, the intersection of politics and education, changes in curriculum, and the impacts of socioeconomic status on schooling. In 2014, she was part of a team nominated for a National Newspaper Award for a series that measured and analyzed the impact of income inequality in Canada. And when she's not reporting, and I can attest to this because there's a couple occasions where the meeting has come from an arena, you can find her at a local hockey arena cheering on her two young children. So Caroline will be our moderator tonight, and I'm very pleased to hand it over to you, Caroline.
Thank you, Kathy. And yes, it's my night off from the arena. I'm happy to be here. Hello, everybody. I am moderating this panel, and tonight's discussion is going to focus on the challenges of getting into the office and the importance of diverse voices. It'll also offer advice for all of you, for those who are in the middle of a campaign or who are choosing to seek office in the future. I just want to advise you that the meeting is being recorded and it can be accessed on the OPSPA website after the event, likely tomorrow. I'll start by asking the panelists a series of questions, but we will also have some time for your questions. So if you have one for all the panelists or a single panelist, please email communications@opspa.org. And we'll try to get to your questions by the end of this session. I'm going to start by quickly introducing our panelists so we can get down to the questions. Peggy Nash is joining us today. She's a former MP for Parkdale-High Park and an advocate for labor rights and social justice issues. Hi, Peggy. We have Suzanne Nurse, who's a former trustee at the Peel District School Board, where she served for 12 years. Suzanne may be retired, but she remains active in education through community groups and scholarship programs. We also have Kristin Murray joining us today. She was appointed mayor of the city of Timmins in August, and she was elected as a city councillor in 2018. Am I right, Kristin? 2018? Kristin was born and raised in Toronto's Jane and Finch neighborhood and later moved to Northern Ontario. And finally, we have Steve Anderson. Steve Anderson is the Deputy Mayor for the town of Shelburne and a senior litigation lawyer with over 17 years of experience with the Toronto Transit Commission. Hello to all of you. I'm going to start with Steve as our opening question to all of you. Steve, you're on the hook here. Steve, what made you interested in running for politics? Did anyone encourage you along the way to go there?
Sure. Sure, I'll break the ice, right?
Yes.
Why I decided to get into politics, I think like most people or a lot of people, I was somewhat frustrated with politicians and results, not necessarily representing some of the values and the things that I thought were important to me and members of my community. And so I decided that instead of continuing with the frustration, I might as well step up and do something. And I think in large part, maybe the reason why I felt that the politicians at the time weren't representing the things that mattered to me is because there were none of them that really looked like me, that had the same lived experiences, that may have valued the things that were important to me. And so I had to sort of get out of my comfort zone because it's not like I have a history of politicians in my family, a strong network of people that I could have sort of bounced things off of. And so I just decided, look, I really got to get out of my comfort zone, try to figure out how I could do this. And then whatever it takes, then that's what I'm going to do, because I can't continue to sit there and be frustrated as to why other people are not doing things that I think are important for me. So that's why. In the encouragement, yes, certainly when I made the decision to go, I had, a close family and friends that said, hey, Steve, you could do this. And I think anybody who's looking to put themselves, some will say in the bullseye, but certainly in the public where you're likely to be scrutinized, you're certainly going to need some people who are going to encourage and support you along the way. And I know we're going to touch on that a little bit later on.
Yes, we will. Kristin, over to you. Introduce yourself and what made you interested in running for politics, and did you receive encouragement along the way from anyone in particular?
Thank you. I'll just first introduce myself in the language. So Wache Miswe, Kichita Wisiwen, Mikaso Squeo. So hi everyone, my name is Sacred Eagle Woman. So yeah, in terms of how I got into politics, it's interesting because I never imagined that I'd be here, really shy, quiet, growing up, but always had something to say. And I think really when I did speak, typically it was very meaningful, but I had individuals who saw something in me as I was growing up, specifically one of my bosses who suggested I take leadership courses and Toastmasters. And so now current day, all these things were like the building blocks of who I've become, which is so important. So the reason why I ran in the 2018 election was because I saw the slate of candidates and knew that an election was coming up, and I didn't necessarily see anyone who looked like myself. So similar to Steve, I was a little bit perplexed because I thought, how do these people know how to make decisions on behalf of myself and my young children when, many of them don't have young children and none of them look like me, right? Or look like the community. So that sort of really encouraged me to run. I did definitely seek support within my family before I put my name in, because it's really not a singular thing, right? You have to make sure that you have the support and that throughout your being in the public eye, that your family is going to be okay with being in the public eye as well. It's not a individual thing. It's a family thing. So that's how I got involved. Thank you.
Thanks, Kristin. Suzanne, how did you get into the trustee role? What prompted you to go there?
Thank you, Caroline, for the question. I guess long story short, I saw a need in our community and I decided to put my name in the hat and run for it. So way back in the day, as I'd like to say, I'd had an opportunity to go to a school board meeting. And I remember that there was a woman who had a question during the Q&A period, and she was so incredibly nervous. She was almost trembling when she was at the front. And I remember sitting there thinking to myself, she shouldn't have to go through that. Somebody should be able to stand in the gap and advocate for her. And then it became like a perfect storm. Once I thought about it, researched what the role of the trustee was, the trustee in my area decided not to run again. So it was an open seat, put my hat in the ring, and with, just as the other panelists have said, massive family support, because you cannot do this without family. So with family and friends support, we ran in 2003.
Thank you, Suzanne. And Peggy, what made you interested in running for politics?
Well, I ran at a different level, not the trustee level, but I maybe some would say foolishly started, well, I think I'll run to be a member of parliament. And but unlike the other panelists, I don't come from a political family. My family's working class. Nobody ever thought that anyone in our family would be elected to anything. But I think that's one of my motivations, seeing cutbacks, and I had been a negotiator, really fighting to improve the lives of working people, and seeing laws that were getting changed, that were leaving working people further and further behind. That I found very frustrating. Also, as a parent of 3, I had been an advocate for childcare, a national childcare program since the 80s, and seeing governments promise that and never deliver. Until now, we're getting childcare agreements that have been negotiated, but seeing over the decades that never came to fruition, and seeing programs like our healthcare that were getting cut back, I felt if people are going to be elected and they're either not going to do anything or they're going to block progress, then step aside. I want to go in there. And it's not that I thought that I would be the best person, but I knew that I would fight for what our community really wanted. And that was my motivation.
Thanks, Peggy. I'm curious about, you told us about how you got into it, but I'm curious about the barriers, especially for women and people of color, the barriers to enter politics, and how you sort of overcome them. Kristin, I wanted to start with you, just sort of reflecting back at sort of the barriers of entry, but then now that you're in politics, what do you see as some of the barriers that remain, and how people should look to overcome those?
Thank you. Yeah, just I guess I should start by saying that I'm Black and Indigenous, and I'm a woman. So, I fit into a lot of those intersectionalities of the demographic that's usually a victim of racism. So, when I decided to run, that was definitely something I prepared myself for, just given the fact that I live in a small northern city where it's not very diverse at the time. So I prepared myself for the worst, which is sad to say. And I think that's why some people, are not so apt to want to run, because of the fear of what could happen. But I was really surprised, I must say, that people really allowed me to speak before making judgments. The comments I do get are, wow, you speak so well, or, oh, you're smart. And I'm thinking, well, yeah, I think there's, the stigma or stereotype about a certain person's look or skin color that dictates who they are. So that still happens. I happen to look a lot younger than I am, so people think I'm a kid, which always, doesn't necessarily play to my favor. But you prove yourself in what you believe in how you navigate certain meetings and conversations, and I think that really rings true. In terms of some of the successes, I feel is conversations are now being had where they weren't before, right? So equity, diversity, inclusion is at top of mind for a lot of organizations. And for me, it's not performative. It's actually really carrying out these things because they are important to me and community, especially because we're getting so diverse. So it's a little bit about that. And I'll let some of my fellow panelists talk, because I'll probably talk for too long. So thank you.
Anybody else want to jump in there? What are some of the barriers that you found sort of entering the political space?
I mean, I could certainly
Yeah.
I mean, there is, I would say there is internal and external barriers. The internal is, do you believe yourself you could do this? And that could be, again, some of we talked about earlier, is, do we see ourselves reflected in this space? There's a saying, seeing is believing, and the same thing applies when you're trying to navigate in this space. And so, you know, for me, a lot of it was, can I do this? Will people want to vote for me? I tend to be different than, you know, the rest of these candidates and how they typically look, or the people who are elected into office. And so will people see past the obvious and want to cast a ballot for me? And so I think one first has to get out of their own head and really convince themselves that, yes, this is possible. And this is where the network of individuals really come in to really pump your tires, because there are days, just based on a comment that you hear here or there, where your tires will be completely deflated. And so having that team around you is crucially important, whether they're experienced or not. It's not the experience, it's the comforting words that carries you through. The external is, yes, I think when we're running for office, racialized individuals in particular, is I always feel like we have to be superhuman. We have to speak so perfectly, act so perfectly, and be what I think people perceive us or want us to be, which is, hey, I hope they don't speak with an accent, you know, make sure that their hair is cut properly or their hair is straightened, and fit into this mold where people then could now feel, okay, they're acceptable. And I think when we often fall into that trap, we lose our true selves and our authenticity because we're trying to be more like other people rather than ourselves. And I think sometimes that could be a challenge, a barrier, however you want to look at it, when entering into this space. And let me just say in closing on this aspect is, even when you are in office and you think that that's now behind you, it is not. And I know we're going to talk about social media and all this other stuff, but you are constantly still dealing with this stuff, even when you're in office.
But Steve, and maybe someone else wants to jump in, how do you overcome that sort of not the social media, but just getting into office? How do you overcome sort of that perception of you got to look a certain way, you got to talk a certain way, you got to, you know, your style has to be a certain way? What did you do, Steve? Or how did you overcome that sort of mentality?
I think honestly, I think I may have fallen into the trap because I feel like I constantly still have to do that. I don't know if I could truly be my authentic self, and for people, whether in my community, well, particularly in my community, well, if I showed a different side of myself, a side of myself that grew up in Jane and Finch, like Kristin, would people find that acceptable? If I talked about that and I lived at Jane and Eddystone and all the things that I used to do back, would people still receive me in the same way? And so instead of talking about that, I'm focused on the fact, oh, I'm a lawyer and I'm this and I'm an author and all this other stuff, because I know that that's what people are going to look at and say, okay, he's qualified. And so, you know, I'm still trying to figure it out. I'd love to tell your audience that here's the magic pill, but I haven't formulated it as of yet.
Thank you, Steve. I am curious, sort of, you know, Suzanne, I want to get your thoughts on this about why you think or why you believe that elected representatives should reflect the community, the diversity of the community. Why is that so important, Suzanne?
You know, I think some of the panelists have already touched on that. It's for any organization, whether it's a school board, council, parliament, if you don't have representation at those levels, there's absolutely no way that you could represent your constituents. You have to have those lived voices and experiences at the table, making those decisions, creating those policies, procedures, guidelines, or else you can't govern. So if any organization believes that they could keep it as homogeneous as it has been in the past, they're going to fail. And we've seen that happen time and time again, not just with school boards, but as I said, with other organizations as well. It's 2022. We really should be doing better at this point.
Peggy, do you want to weigh in here? Why is it so important that elected officials represent the diversity of their community?
Yeah, I feel strongly that the people who are affected by decisions need to have their voice at the table. So if you're talking about housing policy or tenant rights or minimum wage or whatever the issue is, for schools, obviously, I mean, it's very personal for trustees. Like, these are our kids, and you need that lived experience making decisions, or else you're flying blind. And I was really struck by Steve's comments about, you know, not being sure if you should reveal yourself. And I've spoken to a lot of people who are thinking of running, and I'm struck by how often we get in our own way in terms of doing what we really want to do, but we're all full of insecurities. And something that I have found is that our stories and the hurdles that we've faced and overcome, or maybe are still struggling with, these are often very, very powerful stories that bring people to us. And it can be difficult to formulate those stories sometimes. And I'm not saying, you know, public office is a therapy session, but I think people respect if we've had, you know, if maybe we didn't have all the advantages growing up, but yet we found a way, and maybe got an education or I don't know what, however, overcame challenges, and now this is where we're at, and we're presenting ourselves as people who have this lived experience. I think that can be very motivating for others who maybe share different, but in some ways similar stories.
So I'm kind of curious about your thoughts. This is a big question, but who or what do you think is to blame for the lack of diversity in the political space that we're seeing? Does anybody want to weigh in here? I don't want to pick on anybody, but Kristin, do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I hesitated at first, but I figured, hey, why not talk about a little controversial topic? So, you know, being an Indigenous person, I can definitely say colonization and the Indian Act definitely contributed to Indigenous people's involvement in politics, in lack of trust around the whole political, I don't want to call it a game, but politics in general. And so when I think about, you know, women weren't allowed to vote, Black people weren't allowed to vote, Indigenous people were not allowed to vote. So that contributes to kind of current day. So when I was running my 2018 election, I had to appeal to the masses because I knew historically these people could not vote. So would they vote today? Right. So I certainly think that, you know, these pieces of legislation that have been in place historically impact current day. Right. So, you know, we don't see as much Black politicians. We don't see as much Indigenous politicians and females. Right. So, I mean, maybe I'm getting a little too passionate, but I really think that those pieces of our history still impact us today.
I appreciate you bringing your passion into this, Kristin. I think it's worth talking about. Suzanne, do you have some thoughts on that, on how sort of what is the blame, who is to blame, or what is to blame for the lack of diversity in politics?
I think there is definitely an aspect of, let me say for myself personally, sometimes it's easier to speak from the personal, not seeing, at least at that time when I ran, a Black female in office. So I don't see anybody who looks like me, who talks like me. So what makes me think that I can actually aspire to those positions? So when you don't see it, sometimes it's hard to aspire to it. And when you have the voices around you that tell you it's too hard, you don't understand what it's going to take to run, you're going to have to put this at the back burner, you've got a mother of young kids you've got all this noise around you that makes you think it's absolutely impossible. How much money are you going to have to run this thing? Who's going to put up, get down to nitty gritty, who's going to put up your signs? Who's going to run your campaign? You get those blockages of fear that come up that tell you this is not for you, you can't do it. And I think many of us actually, especially as Black women, we hear that when we try to get into politics, you can't do it because. So I think something that Steve had mentioned earlier, sometimes we have to get out of our own way and take that leap of faith, because the worst case scenario is what? You lose. You haven't really lost yourself. All you did is lost the election, but you tried, you put your foot forward, perhaps trying again another time.
Thank you, Suzanne. I want to, sorry, Peggy, do you want to jump in at all on this? No, okay. I
was just going to reinforce the notion of stereotypes, and but I think others articulated that well.
Thank you.
If I may, Caroline,
Of course, Steve, go ahead.
Just very briefly, I would like to put part of the bullseye on the educational system. I think in the educational system, many of us are not reflected in the curriculum. At a very young age, if there was imagery, there were stories, there were examples of racialized folks being in these spaces, because myself and Kristin are not the first individuals to be in politics that look like us, right? And so if that information was being taught from a very early age, then individuals would be leaving our system thinking to themselves, this is actually possible for me. And I don't have to scroll through a newspaper or accidentally come across Kristin or Steve's story or somebody else's story, and then finally believe as an adult, well, maybe I could do this, right? And so I think and we've been hearing from advocates, you know, when we say representation matters, it's not just a hashtag, it actually means something, right? And so if you have that in the schools, whether it's showing more women in positions of power or anybody else that are normally excluded or marginalized, I think that will go a long way in allowing people to believe that these things are actually possible. For the longest while, let's end with this, I never saw any Black pilots. I went to an event well into my advanced stages of my life right now, where I saw at an event about 10 or 15 pilots from Air Canada, WestJet, and I was stunned because, first of all, growing up to the elementary system, high school, I never saw that. And so to think that I could see myself as a pilot when I was going through the educational system was off limits. And so I think the educational system has a significant role to play in curtailing the fear that we have or the doubt that we have that these things are possible.
Thank you, Steve. That's a really good point. Thank you for raising it. I just want to remind our audience that if you do have questions for any of our panelists or all our panelists, you can email communications@opspa.org. I want to shift the discussion into campaigning and how you campaign. I'm going to start with Suzanne. Can you share, Suzanne, some campaign tips, some campaign advice on how to reach a larger audience?
Sure, start with me. Easy question. I think for most of the individuals who are watching, they should be well into their campaign at this point. One of the first things you need to do, though, is pull together your campaign team. You got to have a group of people around you who your think tank, your support mechanisms, all of that. So that really should have been pulled together even before you put your hat in the ring. To reach that larger audience, you have to know your community. How can you reach them? I know we're going to talk about social media later, but some communities are not on social media. So you could spend all this time coming up with a great Facebook page, Twitter account, Instagram, but nobody's going on it. So you basically wasted your time. The best way, it's a hard way, but the best way is getting out to the doors, as many doors as you can, because people want the face-to-face. I could tell you the amount of times when we were campaigning, people would say, you're the only one who's come to my door. Haven't seen anybody, haven't even seen a flyer. You're the only one who came to the door, so you're going to get my vote. Because it's hard, because you're really running a ground war. You most likely don't have a ton of volunteers. You might have a huge ward, so you can't cover it all, but you can't neglect that face-to-face encounter at the door. So my advice is, as much as you can get out there for people to see you, to hear your passion, your ideas, and everything else, that is the best strategy for success, really and truly.
Thanks, Suzanne. I saw everybody nodding their head on going to the door. Steve, do you have any sort of further advice on sort of reaching an audience, some tips for the campaign trail?
Yeah, I would say don't start to get to know your audience at the time of the elections. Is if you're living in the community before the election period comes, you should be involved in your community. So it's not a big stretch and it doesn't feel necessarily overwhelming. Like now I have to get thousands of people to get to know me. They should probably already know you already in some facet if you're involved in your community. So that's number one. If you're ever thinking about running, then get to know your community, be involved in your community. So that when you actually get to somebody's door, the hope is they'll say, oh yeah, I know who you are. I saw you at so-and-so, or I saw you at this event. And you're already now walking to the door with a form of credibility, because the worst thing that you could do is get to somebody's door and say, I want your vote. And nobody knows who the hell you are because they've never seen you anywhere before. And so get involved. But I agree with Suzanne. I mean, it's a multi-pronged approach, whether it's social media, but you just can't. Before I got to tonight's session, I was out doing door knocking. And exactly what Suzanne said is exactly what I've been hearing for weeks. You're the only one that's come to my door. I haven't heard anybody. You've got my vote. And I'm thinking to myself, thank goodness the other candidates are not coming because I need these votes. And so, yes, nothing beats door to door. And I'm sure the others will say that as well.
Kristin, Peggy, I would love to add your voice to this on what advice you have on the campaign trail. Kristin, do you want to go first?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. And just to talk about door knocking too, I think when you go out, it's intimidating. I remember the first time I went door knocking and somebody on my street who was very close, before I got to say the H and hello, slammed the door in my face. But it just allowed me to pivot. Was it too early in the election? And just think about what's my strategy going to be? And it just allows you to grow thicker skin and go back out there. So just keep in mind too, that you're not going to have everyone having engaged conversation with you. There could be some people who don't want to vote. And it's important that you don't take that personally, because if you're getting discouraged at the door knocking phase, when you get into politics, it gets a lot harder. So door knocking is absolutely key, as some of the others on the call said as well. So I think that's and having more than one strategy in terms of how you get out there. Before I got into politics, I was working in the social service field within my community for about 18 years. So that's how people knew me, right? They knew what I stood for, some of the ethics. So it was a good transition. I'm still working in the field actually. So it was great for, people who knew me in that capacity for my campaign that way. So, I support some of the other things that were said because, they ring true for me. Thank you.
Thanks. Peggy?
Yeah, I agree with what everyone has said. And it is challenging when you start door knocking. I absolutely remember the very first door that I knocked on, and I was fine knocking on doors for other people, but for myself, it was a bit intimidating. Having enough money to make a good little flyer that says what you stand for with a nice picture, hopefully one that you make eye contact in. And I always call it a prompt, because when you go to the door, you hold this up and you introduce yourself and I'm running for school trustee, and you give people something to focus on if you have a piece of paper, and it makes you look more official. And I always found that helped. So having that, and if you can, go out with other people, with other volunteers, even if it's your spouse or your best friend or one of your kids, going out with someone, I found it very helpful because, you do meet, most people are great, they'll tell you what they're thinking, or if they're too busy, they'll say so, but every so often you do meet someone who can be insulting. And I found going door to door with someone that I could share a laugh with. It meant when you're leaving, you would giggle over something when somebody said, I think I'm going to vote for you. You think somebody hit me in the head that I vote for you. We would laugh over that. Whereas if you're on your own, you might tend to take it more personally. And I began to feel, it's nothing personal. These people don't know me. it's politics. And if they're not engaged or they are actively opposed to voting, and some people are, well, I can't, I'd like to change it, but I can't necessarily. So you can't take it too personally.
Caroline, if
Peggy-
I could just,
Yeah, of
if I
course,
could
Suzanne.
just something that Peggy mentioned, it can be very difficult, it can be intimidating, but you meet some wonderful people when you're on the campaign trail. And I still have, people who've become lifelong friends. And there's almost every time you go out, you'll come back with a giggle. There's always something that's going to make you smile. One of the things that I remember vividly, I think it was my first campaign, had my flyer, as Peggy said, hitting the doors. I introduced myself. My name is Suzanne Nurse, and I'm running for the position of school board trustee. No lie, more than once, somebody said, that's great, we need more nurses in our schools. It happens.
Suzanne,
So
I love that story.
You have to learn to laugh, because like I said, you meet such a great variety of people. I actually at the end of my last term, I really started to enjoy door knocking because the people are great. People are wonderful.
I love that story, Suzanne. And the journalist in me now wants to know, Peggy said she remembers her first door knock. And I want to know the story, Peggy. What happened?
Well, I had this color flyer, and it was a big flyer. We made it big intentionally because we wanted to really make a splash because it was my first campaign. And so my hair, I had done my hair and I looked, as good as I could look. But the day that I went out, it was like a light snow. It was February. And it was a light snow. And I remember the street I was on. And when I got to this door, I was kind of this drowned rat catching this flyer. And the person kind of took a double look. Was it really me? So maybe not the smartest way to start off. But I just have to say, I agree with Suzanne. Most people are great and interesting, and they're so appreciative that somebody's taking the time to come to the door and ask them their opinion. So I love canvassing. It's great.
That's great. And maybe January is not the best month to do it. I wanted to talk to you, Steve, and open this up to everybody. So individuals from traditionally underrepresented groups, how do we better support people from underrepresented groups to enter politics? Steve, you touched on education earlier and sort of starting young and showing them that there are people who are doing it. But how else can we do that?
One of the buzzwords in 2022 is allies, and I guess I'll just use it again for the purpose of this discussion and the question. When I actually got on council, I was the only racialized person on council, but a number of them did reach out to me and sort of take me under their wings to say, "Hey, listen, Steve, you're new, and let me show you the ropes." And that really meant a lot to me because, like I said, it's not like I had a network of friends or other people that I knew that I could draw upon for that level of expertise. Emotional support, yes, but expertise, no. And so I think if we have more individuals like that I experienced at the council table that will reach out, whether elected or just reaching out to members of the community that is increasingly becoming diverse, even in northern communities. And I think if you make yourself present and available and say, hey, listen, I'm going to go and try to encourage these young group of individuals that may not look like me, but maybe they have potential, and I'm going to show them the ropes. And I think that really goes a long way of really inspiring, encouraging individuals to consider it as an opportunity.
Kristin, do you have any thoughts on that? How to encourage individuals from underrepresented groups to enter politics?
Yeah, I think, being in this space now, just like Steve, so I was the first person of color ever on council and to serve as mayor. And it's so empowering for community to know that they see themselves in that space. So what I've been doing is really engaging with a lot of people who have said, I'm interested, but there's a bit of hesitation, and just let them know, it's a great space to be in, especially if you want to create change. And I think, by being that person that others could look up to, and there's others too. Operation Black Votes Canada has been a really great resource in terms of me being so far in the north and not, that's how I met Steve. I didn't know very many Black politicians, so I felt, unsupported and isolated up in the north. So, just tapping into these resources that do exist, or clubs or groups that, support you along the way is wonderful, because I think, when you feel isolated, you start to question, is this where I want to be? Is this a space that I was meant to be in? But, when you have that support, it's wonderful.
Thanks, Kristin. So for people running for the first time or thinking of running for the first time, Peggy, what advice do you have for them?
Well, I think, build a strong team, and others said that before. Have a team, make the team diverse, but make it a team that you really, really trust, and delegate. I know when I first ran, I had a tendency to want to do everything myself, and that's a mistake. Your job as a candidate is to be out meeting people, talking with people. So if you have a team, let them do their job. If someone is doing communications, or they're analyzing the data of the support you've collected, let them do that job. And look after yourself. Make sure that when you're campaigning, because going door to door is wonderful, but it's emotional work, and you need to recognize that you need a breather every so often, to really just look after yourself and make sure that you stay connected with the people you love and the people that are supporting you doing what you want. But you can't just drop all the emotional stuff onto your family. You've got to have a bit of depressurizing time. Those are some of the things. I guess we're going to talk about social media, but getting yourself out there, and if you're a first-time candidate, any earned media you can get is really helpful. So if you've been campaigning or advocating for something in the community, don't hesitate to phone up a reporter. Have one of your teams phone up a reporter and try to get your name out there. That can also help you, in addition to all of your face-to-face work.
I think we really want to get into that question on social media. So why don't we just jump right into it? Okay.
Caroline, could I just
Suzanne,
one quick,
please.
sorry, because this is
course.
something I've been passionate about for a bit. So forgive me for going a bit of a tirade. One of the most important things, if you are thinking of running, is please make sure you understand the office that you're running for. Because too often, you've seen campaign flyers come through, people making promises that either are impossible to keep or have absolutely nothing to do with that particular office.
Yeah.
And the last thing you want to do is you run, you win, you get sworn in, then what? Can you keep those promises? Well, no, because those weren't up to you to make. And you disappoint the community, you disappoint yourself, extreme frustration. You need to do your homework first and foremost about that position. And I find that happens very often with the office of trustee. People think it is the low end of the political ladder. So I just kind of get in, do it for a term, then run for something else. So people don't really learn too much about what the office is about. And that does a disservice to the community, and it does a disservice to the kids. The trustee position is the only elected position whose only responsibility is to advocate for children. It's the only one. Has to be taken seriously. So you have to know what you're getting into before you get into it. My little tirade.
No, that's really good point, Suzanne. Does anybody, Kristin or Steve, do you want to step in on how the advice you have for people who are considering running for the first time or who are currently running for the first time?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about Suzanne's comments, and they ring true. because I find some people, their motivation to run is because they are upset with how things are currently running. But if you don't understand bylaws or local legislation, and you're going in and making promises, as Suzanne had said, that's going to be to your detriment, because, you know, if you look at a council and voting and how things are passed, it's not one person alone, right? And I think there's this idea that, you know, I'm going to shift and move and change bylaws and whatnot, and that's just not possible, right? You have to have the support of your fellow councillors, and luckily, you know, not even with my own children, I never make promises. Because you never know what could happen. So, you know, you could have a platform, absolutely, that's what you'll work towards. However, making promises and false promises is never to anyone's benefit. And then another tip would really be just stay true to yourself. You know, as you navigate your election, you'll have individuals telling you how you should dress, how you should look. I had someone tell me that I should cut my hair, which is, you know, as a Black and Indigenous person, not something that you should say to anybody. But, you know, there's always going to be something, but really stay grounded and stay true to who you are, because if you don't, along the way, you'll become lost. So that's really my one point that I really wanted to drive home, is just, you know, staying true to yourself.
Thanks, Kristin. Steve, do you want to add anything to this discussion on first time people running for the first time? Sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm just going to pick up on what Peggy said. You know, when you're running and you're the candidate, you know, it's to be expected the focus is on you, and you're locked and loaded. And depending on how long the campaign is for, you know, you're really self-absorbed in what you're doing. And this is something that I've learned along the way, because I've made some missteps myself, because when I have a task, I just get super laser focused on that task, and I don't want to be distracted. But when you have family and friends or children that are around you, sometimes they suffer as a result of that laser focus. And even though you're thinking that, man, if I do this, my community is going to benefit, my family is going to benefit, at the end of the day, if you do get there, and even if you don't, you realize that you actually probably burnt some bridges along the way or hurt some feelings along the way, because you weren't mindful and you weren't paying attention to the people who are around you and who really care about you. And so I guess one thing I would say is, don't get too busy where you can't take time to spend with people who care about you. Because if you make it a point to do that, then you won't have to worry about doing damage repair afterwards. And so I would just, again, further expound on what Peggy said. I thought that was a really good point. And it was something that I think to some degree I learned the hard way until somebody checked me on it and said, hey, Steve, I'll just give you one quick example. I had some volunteers come. These new volunteers I had not met. A friend of mine had brought them over. And so I met with them as soon as they got to the house, and I was like, laser focused. Okay, guys, here's the clipboard. Here's where we're going. And then we left. When that same friend contacted me after it was all said and done, he was saying to me, Steve, you know, the guys were saying that they understood that you were busy and that you had to give them instructions and you had to get out, but you at least could have stopped and asked them, hey, how was your day? How was the travel up here? And just really showed a genuine interest in those individuals. But because I was so laser focused, I'd forgotten about that. And so again, just be mindful of the people who are around you, especially those who are supporting you. Show them some love as well.
Thanks, Steve. So in this discussion, we've talked about social media and how you put campaign material on social media. Maybe one of the ways to reach people, another is door knocking. But one of the big things around social media that many people are dealing with is the hate and the vitriol that comes with it. So I want to get all your thoughts on the use of social media. How do you deal with it? How do you deal with what comes through? Can I start with Suzanne? Would you like to start the discussion, please?
So are you talking about social media as you're campaigning or once you're in office, or both?
Both. So let's
Okay.
talk about it, because you did touch on it around campaigning
Mhm.
earlier. So once you're in
Right.
office as well.
Right. So during the campaign, I really believe you need to, I think somebody said it earlier, you need to understand the constituents that you're looking to represent. Are they the type who are active on social media? Because if they are, then therefore you need to have a pretty active social media campaign out there too. So when you go to community events, you got somebody taking photos and you're posting it, whether it's on Facebook, Insta, whatever platform that you choose. It's the interesting part comes when you're engaging with people, when you're having those dialogues with people who are dropping comments on your pictures, on your interactions. Sometimes incredibly positive, lovely, but there can be a lot of hate that's directed at you, especially if you're a person of color, especially if you're a woman who's a person of color. So what we used to do is we got myself off the social media, because you don't need that type of negativity in your head as you're trying to get to the doors, because that can really affect your spirit. So we had individuals who actually monitored social media for the campaign. They knew what the talking points were, they knew how to answer, they knew how to deal with the hate. And unfortunately, some people had to be blocked, but it can be very, very draining if you are trying to do it by yourself. So I would highly recommend, if you have an active social media aspect of your campaign, see if you as a candidate can distance yourself from it somewhat, because those negative comments, I'm sorry, they hurt, especially if you know that you're doing everything you possibly can. People come up with things, I think Kristin had said comments about hair and other ridiculous aspects. You need someone to kind of put like a buffer between you and that. And when you get into office, it's a little bit different, because when you're in office, I think there is an expectation, especially at the trustee level, that you are responsive. You're not, there's nobody else. Because one thing people don't know about trustees, you don't have staff. You're it. So you're handling your phone calls, you're handling your emails, you're also handling your social media. So you need to learn how to navigate through the negativities. Make sure you understand from the school board's perspective what some of your talking points are, because if some things are confidential, you cannot put it out there or else you'll be disciplined. So it's not an easy answer, sorry, and it's not something that you'll learn straight away. It's going to be trial and error. But when it comes to the campaign, first off, as I said, learn first if social media is something that resonates with your constituents. If it is, go for it. If not, spend more of your time at the doors, flyer drop, that type of thing. Once you get into office, work with your communications team, because most school boards do have a communications team. I think Caroline knows Brian Wooden quite well. Work with your communications team to have them give you some guidelines about how to behave on social media. It could be a great thing, but it could be soul draining as well.
Kristin, how do you deal with social media and what comes
Sure,
out?
I'll be fully transparent. So Facebook was a great mechanism during my 2018 election and my campaign. Shortly after, what I was finding was, after a council meeting, I was going online to read the comments, see what people were saying. And then I became a little too consumed with it. So then I thought, is this, feeding me in a healthy way? And it wasn't. So I got off Facebook, I want to say March 2020 or around 2019 or 2020. Was 2020. And I think, now that I'm running another campaign, I'm like, oh, shucks, I wish I had my Facebook, because it, was a great mechanism. However, it didn't feed my soul. It didn't, do me any purpose. And quite a lot of people who don't necessarily get out to vote are the ones making comments on Facebook. They were the ones sort of following on those aspects. So, I love my Instagram and Twitter. Those are my things. I love LinkedIn. And I'm out in the community. So, social media doesn't make or break a campaign. I think if you want to share posts that you have created, you'll have your network do that for you. It doesn't necessarily have to be you. And maybe I'm a little bit old school, but in terms of communication, I like that more formal, either email, phone call type of conversation, not just a Facebook thread. That's just me on a personal level, from an elected official's standpoint. But and to Suzanne's point about staff, in Timmins, we are part-time counselors, so we have to do it all ourselves. So navigating all of these social media networks, as well as your email meetings, it becomes cumbersome. So don't feel that you need to have every single social media platform in order to win your campaign. Just be really effective in your messaging, and be approachable and out there in the community.
Thank you, Steve. What's your viewpoint on social media, and how do you sort of handle it and deal with it?
I mean, I like social media. I'm very active on social media. It's worked really well for me. I always say that if people don't see what you're doing, as far as they're concerned, you're not doing anything. And I go to people's door and they say, hey, listen, I saw, even before I get there with my flyer, as soon as they open the door, like, I saw you on social media. I saw you do that ribbon cutting, or I saw your video. And so I think it's good in getting the message out. Of course, as Suzanne and others have said earlier, that nothing beats personal interaction. But I think if you use the tools that are available to you properly, it could be very successful for you. But the other side of that is then you have the online trolls that are following you. So I don't know if, Caroline, if part of your question is how do you deal with the hate that may come
Yes.
along with that?
Yes.
And you could get off of social media, the hate is going to follow you, whether you're doing an all candidates meeting or you're out in front of the doors. It just seems to follow you around like a bad rash or a storm cloud. And I'll tell you that I consider myself a very strong-willed person. I think growing up in Jane and Finch and becoming the person that I am right now, that you have to have thick skin and be a person that is really fighting for your own cause. But it is really through prayer. I'm not even kidding you. I know this is not popular for people to talk about nowadays, but that is really the only thing that really gets me through. And I have a family, my mom, that's constantly praying for me every day. And it's that faith, whatever your faith may be, but for me, it's that faith that keeps me through, because I just know that there's somebody else that is looking out for my best interest. And if I stay focused and I stay faithful, things are going to be okay. Because even the most strong-willed person is going to be impacted by some of the stuff that you see and you hear. And you have to have something that grounds you and reminds you of who you are and what you're about. And not let anybody dim your light.
Thank you, Steve. I like that. Don't let anybody dim your light. Peggy?
Yeah, one of the things I say to potential candidates or first-time candidates is remember your motivation. I sometimes encourage people to actually sit down and write themselves a letter why they're doing this, to remind themselves that when things go sideways, which they can do during a campaign or once you're elected, remind yourself of what was your motivation. Social media can be a great way to push out what you're doing, similar to Steve's comment. If there's no photo, it didn't happen, right? You gotta document. And if it's something you're comfortable with, and I always loved social media. I'm not a big Facebook person, but I love Twitter. And I would always push things out on Twitter. But, Twitter has, it's still a way to engage, but it's also a way to really try to silence people. And whether it's, the not typical people in the media or in politics or any public field, there's a lot of hate. So similar to others on the panel, when I was running or when I was elected, I would push things out because I wanted to be authentic and have my voice on my social media, but I never read the comments. I stopped engaging. And if there was something I needed to engage with, one of my staff would advise me and I might answer. But to me, though, the negatives, like not just the negatives, but the hate is telling people who are not the traditional voices, faces, that they should be quiet, that they should just shut up, they shouldn't be there. And, part of me is stubborn enough that if you tell me I can't do something or shouldn't be somewhere, like, get out of my way, because I'm going to keep coming back. And I know that's easy to say. I know I have a friend who ran for office and she's hijab wearing, and the Islamophobia against her, the sexism against her was horrible. And she needed a whole team to come around her and push back because it wasn't fair that one person should have to deal with that. And ultimately the community came around her and supported her. So it's, I think everyone has to decide their own comfort level with getting on social media. You know, if you're not a big TikTok person, suddenly posting on TikTok when you're running for office is going to look a little phony. So I think everybody has to decide their own comfort level. But I would say if someone is thinking, I don't want to run because of the hate online, I think that's exactly what those haters want to happen. That's exactly why we need more diverse voices to run and to be elected, so that those haters just get drowned out.
You're right. Thank you, Peggy. We're quickly running out of time here, so I wanted to get to some of the audience questions that have been coming in. And if you have further questions, please reach out to communications@opspa.org. One of the first questions is, Suzanne, I'm going to start with you on this. How do you handle constituents who disagree with a decision you have made or supported, for example, like school closures or anything similar to that?
It's always difficult because you want to help families. I mean, I truly believe that's why people run to be, especially to be a trustee, that you want to be there to help. But there will be times that a decision will come through the board that goes contrary to what your community is looking for. If it's something that you truly believe, if that's what you truly support, then that's what you need to stand on. You will not always be in agreement with your constituents. That's just the reality of it. And your constituents will fire off all these threats, like, if you don't do this, if you don't change, we're not going to vote for you the next time. You're going to hear that over and over again. But I think it's been said before, you have to be true to yourself. That if that's something that you believe in, that you could defend, then you stand your ground. Now, one thing that I think some trustees in the past and people running for trustee don't always, it doesn't sit with them too well, is once a decision is made at the board table, that's your policy. You own that policy as a trustee. So you promote it. You do not go necessarily and badmouth it in the community. You uphold the policies and procedures that your board has created. So it's a very delicate dance that you do as a trustee, but make no mistake, you will run afoul of your community over and over again because you will not always be in agreement with them.
Steve, do you want to weigh in here? How do you handle when constituents come to you and say that they don't agree with that decision that you made or supported? What strategies do you use there?
I'm thinking about that Shaggy song. It wasn't me. But
are you going to break out in song now, Steve?
Yeah. No,
look, it works. It works. So look, use what you got.
You can only get away with that for so long, maybe once. But it's interesting. I'll pick up on something that Susan said. Sometimes I think people think that when they vote for you, they own you, and that you must do what they say, and if you don't do it, then they dangle this stick over you that I'm not going to vote for you. And my thought process is, if you don't want to vote for me, I don't care, because at the end of the day, I got to stand for what's right, and I got to stand with its principles. So you don't own me because you voted for me. I appreciate the vote, and there are things that I'm going to do that you'll be pleased with, and there'll be things that you don't. But to get to the question more directly, what I attempt to do is try to have a conversation with the individual and try to explain why we came up with a decision and why I supported that decision, and try to appeal to the person's logic and understanding. Sometimes that works when a person who's open and willing to listen, but there are others who are so filled with, whatever, that they're not interested in listening because they're so enraged at the fact that you went against what they believe in. And so that would be my first step, is to try to have that conversation and appeal to reason and hope that they would understand.
Kristin or Peggy, would either of you like to weigh in here on how you handle sort of constituents or people who come to you and say they don't agree, or they're very disappointed that you supported some decision? Peggy, would you like to step in?
Sure. I think, better to engage with people and explain, as Steve said, than to run from it. If you made a decision and there's a logic to it, then own it. Not everybody's going to agree. That's life. That's democracy. I remember vividly, I had a person phone my office really angry, and he said I was biased against successful white middle-class men. And I thought, well, it was just a message that was left. And I thought, well, okay, I got to call him back. And it was because I had opposed and kind of led the opposition to an appointment by the government at the time that I thought was going to be really bad for Canadians. And so I contacted this person. He was surprised that he got a call back. He just expected he was going to make an angry call and that was it. He was surprised that he got a call back. We had a long conversation. He told me that he now understood. He didn't agree. And I mean, he was never a supporter of mine anyway, but I felt I owed him, as his representative in Parliament, I owed him an explanation. And he was happy that I had called him back, even though at the end we agreed to disagree. So I think that's probably your best bet. You know, we're all reasonable people. If you make a decision and you believe it's for the right reasons, you got to own it.
Thank you. Kristin, I wanted to ask one of the other questions that's come to us is, can you discuss some of the challenges that you faced in your role during the pandemic?
During the pandemic, wow. So there was quite a bit of challenges. I think the primary challenge was meetings, right? They were not in person. And with that, you know, you don't necessarily have great conversations as a group, especially, you know, as a group who has to decide on major things. So, you know, there were instances where your video and your voice is cutting out, and you can't have a very fulsome meeting that way. I think really what our community struggled with was the mask mandate. You know, when it was originally discussed, it was brought up by our then mayor as we're going to have a vote on the masks, when that's not necessarily our role, right? That should be our local health unit to drive that messaging. So then it became a political issue, and then that kind of followed through the entire part of COVID was, you know, the mandates and the vaccination, and people assuming that it was all really the local city council that was driving this, right? You know, people have their conspiracy theories, but I think, you know, that was a challenge that we had to navigate is you know, small northern community and individuals not necessarily thinking that, you know, they should wear masks or get vaccinated and those kinds of things. And you know, it was quite an uproar within our community, and luckily things have really settled. But on a personal level, the challenge for me was, you know, when I set out as a counselor and, you know, COVID hit, there were some things I wanted to accomplish that I just couldn't because of COVID. And, you know, we weren't meeting as often. There was other things we had to pivot really. And our focus was health and COVID wasn't necessarily some of the other issues that I would have loved to focus on. So it really had to shift quite a bit of challenges through that.
Thanks, Kristin. Another question from the audience member who's looking for advice on how to respond, or even if to respond to some triggering emails or questions. For example, a woman of color running for trustee received questions about critical race theory. Suzanne, what sort of advice would you provide there as a former trustee?
That's a good question. Because during the course of your campaign, you will be getting quite a few questions, usually by email, sometimes at the door, that deal with very, very sensitive issues. Hopefully at this point, you have a good understanding of what some of the hot topics are in your constituency. And you would have created your talking points around it so that you're not surprised, especially when you're at the doors. You have to answer it honestly. You have to answer it directly. And I think most importantly, you have to answer. Silence says a lot, because that one email might be one person who's typing the email. You have no idea how many people that individual knows. I will say that you didn't respond. So I don't know how to respond to that particular question about critical race theory. That's really based on what your beliefs are around it. But I would definitely encourage you to answer it. Do not ignore the hard questions, because you will develop a reputation early on as someone who does not want to deal with anything controversial.
And Steve, a question from the audience. What was an unexpected part of your job once you were elected?
I think I was pleasantly surprised of the impact of being in the position that I'm in. I would get messages from people, I thought, I'm a deputy mayor from the small town Shelburne, and nobody's really going to care outside of that and pay attention to what I'm doing. But I would get messages from people from Saskatchewan, across the GTA, saying, they're so proud to see a Black person in this role. I have people who've said, listen, we've moved to the community because we've seen a person like you in the position, and it makes us feel comfortable. And these messages come in over and over again. Just walking down the street, I saw a young Black teenager riding his bicycle, and he was with a friend, and he turned, he recognized me and says, good evening, Deputy Mayor Steve Anderson. And just the mere fact that he felt comfortable doing that in a sense of pride, because it's not too often we have those opportunities to do that. And so when we're in these spaces, despite the hate, despite the sacrifice, the time, it's when you get messages like this, and you see the impact that you can make because of the platform that you have, is what makes it all worth it. And I fully appreciate what being in the platform could do, if used properly. I want to emphasize that. And so that was a pleasant surprise.
Thank you. I'm just going to go into the closing question, because I want to hear from all of you on this. I'm going to start with you, Peggy. Is there a former or current politician that inspired you, and why?
Yeah, I'm going to cite two people. When I was really frustrated about the lack of action and the lack of progress, I had the great opportunity to hear the then Prime Minister of New Zealand, Helen Clark, deliver a speech. And she was talking about things they were doing. They were bringing in a childcare program, progress that they were making, and just seeing her as the Prime Minister of her country, I found that very motivating. And then when our local city councillor at the time, David Miller, ran and got elected mayor, and I thought, wow, maybe somebody from our area can do this. So those two inspired me. But I'd have to, today, I look at somebody like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is what she inspires in me is her defiance and her ability to take all of the opposition that comes to her, like the just the negativity, and she turns that around with a smile and makes it into something fun and hopeful for people that support her. So I see the way she takes the negative energy and transforms it into hope for her constituents. And I think that's she's a real role model, I think, for young women who might be interested in getting into politics.
Thank you, Peggy. Suzanne, is there a former or current politician who inspired you along the way?
There are individuals who I would say fascinate me more so than inspire. I love listening to Barack Obama. I love his turn of phrase, how he's able to sometimes just with a glance or like a positioning of his body, how he's able to pull people into a conversation. I'm fascinated by Donald Trump, about how he's able to capture people's attention. It's not that I'm taking any notes from him, but just fascinated by how he's able to command not just a room, but a stadium full of people with rhetoric. It's mind-blowing. My grounding, where I really want to get my inspiration, I'm a word girl. Like my family have been Bible believers forever. So when I need some grounding, when I need some place to kind of settle myself and pull my inspiration, I pull out my Bible, I pull out my word, and that helps me through numerous situations. Can't even begin to tell you.
Thank you, Suzanne. Kristin, is there a current or former politician who inspired you?
It's interesting because I didn't necessarily see myself in politics, so politicians were not, necessarily individuals that inspired me. However, when I moved from Jane and Finch to Chapleau, so my mom's First Nation, well, our First Nation, the first chief I met was a female, so Chief Candy Korston, and to me it was interesting because she was so close to home. She was in our community. We saw her. She was a leader. So when I think about people who inspire me, they're really social justice advocates, and that could be because that's the social worker in me. So I look to those people, and I don't necessarily consider myself a politician. I consider myself somebody that wanted to create change in my community. So when people give me that label politician, that's not necessarily how I see myself. So to answer your question, certainly the first female chief that I met was quite an inspiration. And if I think about local politics, seeing Noella Ronaldo and how much of a powerhouse she was because she was sitting among many males, really, she was a strong advocate for women and continues to be, even though she's not around that table. So, I like to see those, individuals who aren't, on the big screen, but making big change in community.
Thank you, Kristin. Deputy Mayor Steve Anderson, see what I did there? It's your turn. Is there a current or former politician who inspired you?
Of course, you have people like Jean Augustine, Michael Coteau, Mitzi Hunter are a few names that I could think of. And then I think of a person like Kristin, who, as they would say in the Caribbean, is mashing it up in Timmins and doing her thing. And it's inspiring to see her journey and her ascent. And so even though she's way down there, just rest assured that you're inspiring people across Canada, I would say, just by your story and your perseverance and your authenticity and not being afraid to show your true side, something that oftentimes when we ascend to these positions, we struggle with. So I just want to commend you with that. So, those are certainly the individuals that inspire me for sure.
Great. Thank you. Wow, thank you so much to all of you. This has been, for me, informative. I really enjoyed hearing your stories, especially sort of the personal stories that you shared with our audience. I appreciated that. So thank you for making the time. I'm going to turn it over to Kathy Abraham.
Thanks so much, Caroline. And I too would like to thank you, Steve, Peggy, Kristin, Suzanne, for your stories. We all walk that campaign path or the streets, however you want to put it, in a different way during campaigns. But it's kind of nice to know that some of those things that some of us are experiencing now, okay, we're going to get through this. It's going to be fine, because it's been an interesting campaign this time around, I have to tell you. So I'm really thankful that you were able to join us tonight to share your stories. And thank you, of course, to Caroline for being a wonderful moderator. I've enjoyed getting to know you over the years too, Caroline, and the work you do at the Globe and Mail on education, because that's so important, sharing the stories that we're doing as trustees. And for those of you who are online who are able to join us, I hope you heard something tonight that has inspired you or reassured you maybe, or any number of things. And for those who are running, I wish you I'm going to say that to myself too. All the luck, all kinds of good luck, and good luck with your campaigns. Stay safe out there because, you know, it's sometimes it's a little bit of a challenge, and we just we want everybody to come through this unscathed. So thanks very much for joining us. Thank you for the team for putting this together this evening, and take care, everybody.